Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. Venture into the extraordinary realm of time slips once more with 4 captivating accounts where the veil of time begins to break down. Join us in Jeffersonville, Indiana, where Julie Sanders and her boyfriend come face to face with a 1956 Chevy lost in time. Accompany Mark Walsh as we revisit Bold Street for yet another antiquated encounter in this apparent timeslip hotspot. Follow Margaret Woodward in Edinburgh as she witnesses her surroundings transform into a scene from the 1800s, and Nathan O'Connor at a US oil refinery as a decade-past tragedy replays before his eyes. Automotive apparitions. It was a chilly December evening in 1969 when 17-year-old Julie Sanders and her boyfriend Greg were out on a typical Friday night date in Jeffersonville, Indiana. After socialising downtown with friends, the couple decided to cruise the back roads between the city and Julie's suburb, as they often did. For 6 miles, these rural roads wound past dairy farms and cornfields, with only a handful of homes dotted along them. Several dirt paths branched off into secluded fields that local teenage couples would use for privacy. After the last farm, the narrow 2-lane road became enveloped by dense national forest for nearly 10 miles. With its sharp blind curves and hilly terrain, wrecks were common along the wooded stretch. That night, light snow had begun to fall as Greg and Julie left their usual private spot, aware of Julie's impending curfew. Other vehicles were scarce, but in the distance they spotted taillights far ahead, hugging the turns. Approaching one sharp bend, Greg and Julie suddenly came upon blinding headlights angled towards them from the roadside. A pristine 1956 red and white Chevy Bel Air had clearly failed to negotiate the curve and vaulted from the road. Now overturned, the car rested suspended at a precarious angle, its chrome grille and quarter panels smashed inward from its impact against the trees. Greg quickly pulled his 1960 Galaxy over, while Julie grabbed the flashlight and the first aid kit from the trunk. The couple hurried to assist any injured passengers, but strangely, no one responded to their shouts. Inching closer, they noticed no movement within the crashed vehicle. The engine was still running, headlights shining brightly through the swirling snow. The unsettling smell of leaking gas mingled with burned rubber, permeating the ice-cold air. Greg dropped to his knees, peering into the driver's side window, which was miraculously intact. To the couple's astonishment, there were no occupants at all. The Chevy was completely empty. Mystified, Greg cautiously reached inside and switched off the ignition. After thoroughly scouring the area, Greg and Julie were left baffled as to how an apparently driverless vehicle had wrecked itself along a treacherous stretch of rural road on a snowy night. They alerted the authorities, then reluctantly continued on their way, grappling with a bizarre and eerie experience. The next evening, seeking answers, the couple returned to the crash site with Julie's father. They were shocked to discover the battered sedan still there, but moved into a clearing deeper within the forest. Not only this, but it was now strangely aged and decayed, seemingly by years, after only one day exposed to the harsh winter elements. The formerly pristine cherry red and white Chevy now appeared faded pink, with advanced rust corrosion eating through the body panels. The soft-top canvas roof was mouldy and collapsed inward, and dense vines snaked through the missing rear windshield. Adding to the curiosity, the thicketed hill which they had tried to search the previous night for the victim or victims of the wreck was now a clearing, and further back into the woods just beyond in the trees sat a weathered and abandoned wooden shack which they had not noticed the night before. They later did research on the property, only to discover that the owners had bought the acreage with the dilapidated shack and car on it. Finding no reasonable explanation, Greg and Julie were left haunted and perplexed at the bewildering sequence of impossible events. Over 50 years later, Julie still cannot unravel the puzzle surrounding that inexplicable winter night and its phantom 1956 Chevy. She remains convinced she and her boyfriend at the time briefly crossed paths with a tragic event from another time along that lonely country road. Back to Bold Street. In the early hours of August 13th, 2022, resident Mark Walsh embarked on a late-night errand across Liverpool, England, to pick up his stranded sister-in-law, Amy. She had been out for an evening in the city centre with friends. She was low on money and had called Mark, anticipating that he wouldn't mind giving her a lift, as he had done before. Mark drove downtown at around 12:45 a.m, parking along the narrow cobblestone streets in the rope walks area near Amy's location. He found her waiting on the corner of Bold Street, talking on her phone. As they began to head back to the car, Amy remembered she needed to withdraw some cash. They strolled together towards the nearby ATM just down the deserted street. However, as they made their way towards the building, the lighting in the area suddenly dimmed and a deafening silence seemed to pervade the air. Where the bank should have been, now stood a large wrought iron gate with an oversized horseshoe mounted onto it. Gone were the lit-up shop fronts with their vibrant displays, now replaced by stone and timber facades. Instead of modern street lamps, old-fashioned wrought iron lanterns glowed, emitting a pale amber light into the gloom. Backlit by the dim glow of one of these lanterns, they noticed what appeared to be the shadowy silhouette of an older-style police officer, garbed in a Victorian-era long coat and bobby helmet, and who seemed to be smoking a pipe or cigarette. Overwhelmed by shock and confusion, Amy grasped Mark's jacket sleeve, anxiously whispering, "Where are we?" They stood riveted in disbelief, struggling to comprehend how their surroundings could have shifted so radically in mere seconds into a scene straight out of the 19th century. Then, just as suddenly as the scene had gripped them, Amy and Mark found themselves returned once more to modern-day Bold Street. The bank, lit-up shop fronts and modern street lamps. No evidence lingered of the officer, horseshoe-adorned gate, antiquated building facades or gaslit lanterns they had impossibly witnessed. With his nerves rattled and pulse thrumming, Mark guided an equally stunned Amy to his nearby car. The brief yet terrifying glimpse into another era haunted and perplexed the pair as Mark recounted the bizarre tale to his wife and sceptical friends over the subsequent days. But having shockingly shared the intense out-of-time experience together, Mark and Amy could never fully dismiss its authenticity or explain the surreal events they encountered that peculiar night on Liverpool's Bond Street. There have been many reports of time slips in the Bond Street area over the years, leading many to believe it is somewhat of a hotspot for such phenomena. Echoes of Edinburgh. In the fall of 1987, in Edinburgh, Scotland, Margaret Woodward was running errands in town one evening after work. As Margaret stood at the corner of Cockburn and High Streets, waiting to cross towards North Bridge, her surroundings abruptly transformed. The bustling city scene was replaced with a street from the late 19th or early 20th century. Instead of pavement, Margaret now saw straw and dirt covering the ground. Townspeople dressed in shabby clothing were shoveling manure into a wooden horse-drawn cart. The pungent odour of livestock and waste filled the air. Margaret observed other carriages pulled by horses clopping down the unpaved road. The buildings lining the narrow street were now timber and stone structures with iron gas lamps glowing alongside the road instead of modern street lights. Stunned, Margaret watched the people around her, who were now outfitted in coarsely woven trousers, plain shirts and dresses, with worn caps on the men and bonnets on the women. Chickens and a mangy dog poked through the street debris as a cart trundled past with a load of manure. The scene played itself out over the course of no more than 2 or 3 minutes, and then, as abruptly as it had begun, the scene reverted back to the modern cityscape Margaret had initially occupied. Modern vehicles and pedestrians surged by her once again. A tragic throwback. For the last 2 years, Nathan O'Connor had worked night shifts at a sprawling oil refinery in the southern United States and had made a habit of hiding out in his company truck during the slower overnight hours. Finding a remote corner of the thousands of acres of machinery, pipes and towers to recline unbothered, he would nap away the time while parked near an abandoned section of the facility. This deserted refining unit had seen tragedy a decade prior. During a power outage and emergency restart on a stormy autumn morning in 2013, a disastrous explosion had instantly claimed the life of a young female engineer who had worked at the plant for around 5 years before the incident. The area had remained sealed off since, with rusted chains and weathered danger signs warning employees and trespassers away. On a humid night in the early summer of 2023, amidst a severe regional drought, storms again swept through the refinery. As lightning threatened, the night shift lead halted operations, directing staff to shelter safely until the threat passed. Nathan cruised in his company Ford F-150 truck through narrow passages between hulking chemical tanks and pipes before parking in his usual secluded haunt. The truck sat perched on a metal-grated platform under a web of steel staircases just 100 yards from the decade-old disaster site. Lulled by the percussion of rain pounding on the truck roof, Nathan reclined in his seat, settling in to binge-watch shows on his phone. Sometime before dawn, he drifted into a light sleep. After some time, however, and without warning, an intense radiance jolted him back to squinting consciousness. The truck interior was flooded by a blinding orange light. Instantly overwhelmed by the searing waves of light, his eyes reflexively clenched shut, but in that brief glimpse, Nathan knew he was engulfed by a raging firestorm. Strangely, however, no sound accompanied the inferno, nor could he sense any heat. As rapidly as it erupted, the piercing glare dissipated. Cautiously cracking open one eye, Nathan witnessed a horrifying and heartbreaking sight, the very disaster which had transpired there 10 years prior. A lone woman emerged stumbling from the billowing flames and smoke, clad in burning clothing. After a few frantic steps, she collapsed motionless onto the refinery floor and was consumed completely by the roaring fire. This was undoubtedly the engineer in her tragic final moments of life a decade earlier, just as so many accounts had retold over the years. Then, as unexpectedly as the scene had materialised, it evaporated back into the emptiness of the night, with no evidence of its flames or smoke remaining. Nathan sat frozen in bewildered shock, struggling to rationalise how he could have possibly glimpsed this long-past tragedy unfold before his eyes. Utterly baffled, he clocked out early that morning, still grappling to comprehend the bizarre event. Incredibly, just a few short weeks later, in dense fog, Nathan witnessed yet another perplexing sight near the obsolete rail loading station adjoining the plant. Two unrecognised workers wearing outdated company uniforms were stationed on the decrepit structure, busying themselves connecting hoses to an immense white railway tanker. This antiquated equipment hadn't been functional in years and had certainly not been staged to load anything recently without his knowledge. Both employees' appearances were obscured by the fog in a way that blurred their features like apparitions. When the man passed by the area minutes later on another task, no railcar or phantom workers remained near the dormant equipment. These mystifying experiences left Nathan stunned, yet curious if his workplace occupies some sort of wrinkle in the cosmic fabric of time and space. What enabled him to inexplicably glimpse these scenes from the past? He has numerous speculations, but nothing concrete. Were they caused by the unique geography or landscape energy concentrated in the massive industrial site? Could there be clues tied to this rural location's history and its other documented paranormal activity, like repeated UFO sightings? With more questions than answers, the events continue to dominate Nathan's fascination.